Okay, so back to our timeline. 1957, Sputnik, a Russian satellite, is launched. And it was the first artificial Earth satellite. The Soviet Union launched it into an elliptical low Earth orbit on October 4th, 1957. It orbited for 3 weeks before its batteries died, and then orbited silently for 2 months before it fell back to Earth. And I remember this. This was kind of a big deal. My father got a call from his brother and said, "Hey, come over the house about 7:30. We can see the Sputnik satellite tonight." So my father, my brother, and I jumped in the car and went over to his house. And yeah, there it was. You could see it. It was kind of blinking as it traveled across the sky. But Americans in general were very worried about this. Russia was kind of our competition at the time. We didn't have a satellite yet. This changed things very quickly. One of the changes was in American education. We needed engineers. So what the American school system did previously was kind of a general education focusing on language arts and civics and that sort of thing. After Sputnik, they changed the whole education program to focus on science, mathematics, leading to engineering. Big push for students to continue their education after high school, go to college. And America starts its space program. So first, send up capsules full of animals, see how that does. It creates its first satellite to orbit the world. Eventually, it sends man up on a real quick up and down flight. Eventually, man orbits the Earth 3 times, crashes into the ocean. And President Kennedy makes a statement that we're going to send somebody to the moon by the end of the decade, meaning by the end of the 60s, which he does. He doesn't get to see it, but we do. We eventually land on the moon. From there, we set up an international space station. This becomes a cooperative global effort with astronauts from all over the world going up as a kind of a research center. America creates a telescope that's sent up on its own mission. It's called the Hubble telescope. They set up the space shuttle. A couple of really bad accidents happen as a result of that program. But most recently, within the last year, a new military division has been set up called the Space Force. So astronauts kind of become the superheroes in American popular culture. This is an article from Space Travel in Literature and Popular Culture from astronauts.com. So the story starts with this French author. His name was Jules Verne. And in 1865, he writes a novel entitled From the Earth to the Moon. And in that novel, he actually makes some predictions 100 years before America's space program that actually turn out to be true. And here's some of those predictions that he made that were correct. He said the United States would launch the first manned vehicle to circumnavigate the moon. True. He said the cost of the program would be, in today's price, about $12 billion, and it cost about $14 billion. So pretty good, pretty accurate. He said in his story the spacecraft would have a crew of 3. Well, that was the number and the crew of the moon mission. He said the spacecraft would be built predominantly of a metal called aluminum, which is absolutely true. So in Verne's novel, he actually uses a cannon to launch the spacecraft. And the name of the cannon was called Columbiad. Now, the Apollo 11 command module was named Columbia. So, I mean, come on, how did that happen? In Verne's novel, they look at some sites as to where they're going to shoot this cannon from. And they looked at some sites in Texas and in Florida. And it was finally decided that Florida would be the launch pad for Verne's cannon. And the launch pad for our moon mission was Cape Canaveral, Florida. In Verne's story, the spacecraft was launched in December, and it was about 240 hours long in its flight, and the spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean and was recovered by the U.S. Navy vessel Susquehanna. Well, the Apollo 8 crew was launched in December. 100 years later, the journey was a little shorter, 147 hours. And the spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean and was recovered by the U.S. Navy vessel Hornet. So as you can see, Jules Verne was pretty accurate with his predictions in his novel 100 years before. So we're going to talk a little bit about, from an article called The Many Ways Pop Culture Propels Spaceflight and Vice Versa. You think you know, but you don't. A short but interesting history of pop culture's long-standing relationship with space exploration by SWAPNA KRISHNA in 2019. So 2001, we have a movie called A Space Odyssey. And the This is from pbssocial.org. Pop culture really crystallized around space and American aviation in the 60s. In 1968, 1 year before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon, the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey premiered, with Arthur C. Clarke co-writing the script with Kubrick, a spacecraft heading to Jupiter to investigate a mysterious black monolith. The spaceflight advances shown in the movie may be beyond what we are currently capable of, but there are certainly a few connections that tie in with our own aviation history. The name of the spacecraft is Discovery, which is familiar to anyone who knows the history of the space shuttle. What's more, the movie features private citizens flying to space. In real life, the International Space Station, which was assembled in space, another hallmark of 2001: A Space Odyssey, will begin to play host to private citizens at the bargain price of $35,000 a night. We haven't quite achieved Clarke and Kubrick's vision, but our aviation history is slowly catching up to what some of the greatest minds in the early 2000s would look like in the terms of space travel. So next is Star Trek, a TV program and eventual series of movies, was the brainchild of Gene Roddenberry and envisioned a future in which humankind had begun to explore the stars on missions of peace and exploration. The first episode of the original series aired in 1966, just 3 years before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took their first steps on the moon. The history of the show is in many ways tied to the United States spaceflight ambitions and predicted an era when spaceflight wouldn't be a competition between countries, but instead a collaboration, working together in peace to achieve our mutual goals. In 1977, NASA approached actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on the original series, for assistance with astronaut recruitment. The organization had decided to step up its efforts to attract women and people of color to the astronaut ranks. There are a few moments of aviation history more poignant than the introduction of a new spacecraft intended to take humans to the stars. When NASA named its first space shuttle, one that would be used for in-atmosphere test flights, the organization decided on Constitution. However, then President Gerald Ford, presumably prompted by a massive write-in campaign organized by Star Trek fans, ordered NASA to change the name to the Enterprise. The space shuttle is now on display aboard the USS Intrepid in New York City. Recently, The Martian, which was penned by Andy Weir and turned into a hit movie starring Matt Damon, is one of the likeliest predictors of where human space travel will head next. The story depicts a human mission to Mars in the next 2 decades. While NASA has set a deadline of 2024 to return humans to the lunar space surface, as part of Project Artemis, who is the sister of Apollo from Greek mythology. The current plan is to use a moon base as a springboard for a crewed Mars mission. It's fascinating to look back at pop culture to see how Hollywood and the space program have intertwined, often feeding off each other for inspiration and direction. Other notable films about American space travel. So the movie called The Right Stuff about astronauts. Apollo 13 about a mission that had to return to Earth before it could land on the moon. In music, we have several songs. Moon Dance became popular, sung by Van Morrison. David Bowie's Space Odyssey, Walking on the Moon by Police, and Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Michael Jackson makes famous the dance called the moonwalk. And in art, we have the Pioneer Plaque. And the Pioneer Plaque was a brass artwork that was attached to two exploring interplanetary satellites that show man and where the Earth is located on the space map. So to kind of tie all of this up together, here is a video called How the Moon Landing Changed Pop Culture. So one last bit, Oscar Wilde, Irish writer, made an interesting statement. He says that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Perfect example of this would be pop culture and space travel. Okay, so let's take a look at that video, How the Moon Landing Changed Pop Culture.